Is there a wound deeper than a brother's betrayal? Could the quarrel of Moab and Ammon be the spark that set the Middle East ablaze for thousands of years? The wilderness east of the Jordan lies scorched beneath the merciless sun. Hills roll in silence, their shadows long and brooding, as if they remember every scream and clash that once thundered across their ridges. The dust is ancient, but it carries stories of war. Stories not between strangers, but between brothers, nations born of the same father, yet turned against one another with swords drawn and hearts hardened. Picture it, a cave in the aftermath of Sodom's fiery ruin. Lot's daughters, driven by desperation, commit an act that should never have been. From that forbidden union came two sons, Moab and Ammon. Their names would echo not only in family records, but in the rise of kingdoms. Moab, the father of the Moabites. Ammon, the father of the Ammonites. Brothers by blood, yet destined for enmity. What began as survival twisted into rivalry. What should have bound them together, their shared kinship with Abraham, became the very reason for hostility. Moab and Ammon chose rebellion over covenant, idols over the living God, pride over peace. From their altars rose the smoke of false sacrifices, a stench that would draw the judgment of heaven itself. And so, the cycle began. Armies marching, cities burning, mothers weeping. The Israelites, children of promise, clashed again and again with their cousins across the Jordan. This was no ordinary war for territory. It was prophecy in motion. Every border skirmish, every alliance with pagan empires, every curse spoken over Israel carried the weight of ancient betrayal. Is it not chilling that the echoes of that feud are still with us today? The world watches the Middle East with unease. Conflict flaring like fire in dry grass. Nations trembling at the brink of war. Politicians speak of treaties, generals of strategies. Yet beneath it all lies the same fracture that began thousands of years ago. Moab and Ammon may be gone in name, but their legacy lingers in every rocket, every riot, every stone hurled in anger across the divide. This story is no relic of the past. It is a wound that has never healed, a curse that has never lifted, a prophecy still unfolding before our very eyes. The tale of Moab and Ammon is not merely history. It is the living heartbeat of the Jewish-Arab divide. And so the question stands, if betrayal birthed the war, what will it take to end it? To understand the war of Moab and Ammon against Israel, we must walk back to the very beginning, where dust and destiny were first woven together. The story begins not with kings or generals, but with a man named Lot, nephew of Abraham, the friend of God. Lot was not a villain. He was a man caught between choices, a man who pitched his tents toward Sodom, while Abraham chose the oaks of Mamre. Where Abraham raised altars to the living God, Lot raised his household in the shadow of sin. Sodom and Gomorrah shimmered like jewels in the plain, rich and enticing, yet their beauty hid decay. To live there was to gamble with the wrath of heaven. And wrath did come. Fire rained down upon Sodom, turning its lush valleys into a smoldering wasteland. Lot, warned by angels, fled with his family, his wife looking back against the command of God, only to become a pillar of salt. Lot escaped with his two daughters, hiding in a cave in the mountains, stripped of wealth, stripped of security, stripped even of hope for a future. What happened in that cave would mark history forever. The daughters, believing the line of their father extinguished, resolved to preserve their seed in a desperate and shameful way. One after another, they lay with their father, And from those unions came 2 sons. The elder bore Moab, meaning from the father. The younger bore Ben-Ammi, meaning son of my people. What began as a scandal of survival became the foundation of 2 nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites. These sons were not strangers to Israel. They were kin. Their bloodline traced back to the same Terah, father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. They should have been allies, a living reminder of family bonds, even after the destruction of Sodom. But something darker took root. From their origin in shame, Moab and Ammon inherited a bitterness that turned them against their own brothers. The Torah records their hostility in painful detail. When Israel, freed from Egypt and wandering toward the Promised Land, asked passage through the territory of Moab and Ammon, they were refused. Not only refused, but threatened with war. The Ammonites gathered armies. The Moabites hired Balaam to curse Israel from the high places. A brother's hand, instead of offering bread and water, was raised with spear and curse. The Moabites settled east of the Dead Sea. Their strongholds perched on high plateaus. They worshipped Chemosh, a cruel god demanding human sacrifice. The Ammonites, north of Moab, raised altars to Milcom and Molech, whose fires consumed children in the valley of Hinnom, where Abraham built altars to Yahweh, the God of covenant. Moab and Ammon built altars of blood and defiance. Their rejection of Israel was more than politics. It was spiritual rebellion. Deuteronomy declared that neither Moabite nor Ammonite should enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation, because they did not meet Israel with bread and water on the way, but hired curses against them. Their enmity was etched into covenant law itself. Yet, paradoxically, God also forbade Israel from seizing their lands, for he had given Moab and Ammon their inheritance. They were enemies, yet they were still sons of Lot. In this strange balance, we see the hand of God weaving a story larger than the desert wars. Moab and Ammon were both kin and rival, brothers who could not be cast away, yet whose hostility would not fade. The ancient origins of this conflict are not just about borders and altars. They are about identity. Moab and Ammon defined themselves not by covenant, but by opposition. They chose their gods in contrast to Israel's God. They chose their paths in rebellion to Israel's path. And in that choice, they set their descendants on a collision course that would echo across millennia. The story of Israel, Moab, and Ammon is therefore not just about nations. It is about family broken, covenant rejected, and prophecy unfolding. From the cave in the mountains to the hills east of the Jordan, the stage was set for battles that would thunder not only in the pages of judges and kings, but in the world we know today. The desert winds that once carried the cries of Moabite and Ammonite battles did not blow in isolation. Beyond the hills of Gilead and the plains of Moab, storms were rising, storms that would shake the earth, topple kingdoms, and sweep entire peoples into the dust of history. Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Persia. Names that still echo like thunder across the ruins of the ancient Near East. Moab and Ammon were but small kingdoms, yet they found themselves crushed and entangled within the rise of these empires, pawns in a divine drama far greater than themselves. Assyria was the first hammer to fall. Its kings, ruthless as wolves, carved their empire with iron and fire. They marched into the Levant with chariots that shook the ground, boasting that no god could stand against them. Moab and Ammon trembling at Assyria's might, offered tribute to avoid annihilation. Yet their temporary survival only set the stage for a harsher judgment. For in siding with the enemies of Israel, they aligned themselves against the covenant of God. The prophets thundered against this arrogance. Amos cried out against Ammon, declaring that because they ripped open pregnant women in Gilead to enlarge their territory, fire would consume their palaces. Jeremiah spoke against Moab, mocking their pride. Moab has been at ease from his youth, but the days are coming when I will send to him pourers who will empty his vessels and shatter his jars. These were not merely human politics. They were spiritual verdicts pronounced by the court of heaven. Then came Babylon, the golden head of Daniel's vision. Its ziggurats pierced the skies. Its armies crushed nations like clay underfoot. Nebuchadnezzar, in his pride, gazed upon his great city and declared, "Is this not Babylon that I have built?" Yet even Babylon, that giant of giants, was only a tool in God's hand. The prophets declared that Babylon would be used to humble nations, including Judah, Moab, and Ammon. What chance had the sons of Lot to withstand such a beast? Their altars to Chemosh and Milcom could not save them from the decree of the Almighty. As Babylon rose, so too rose the visions of Daniel. In the night watches, Daniel saw beasts crawling out of the sea: lion, bear, leopard, and a terrifying monster with iron teeth. These empires were not random accidents of history. They were symbols of spiritual dominions, permitted by God for a time. In their shadow, the smaller kingdoms like Moab and Ammon seemed insignificant. Yet the prophets insisted their destinies were no less under divine scrutiny. The scepter of Israel's God reached even into their high places. When Persia swept Babylon aside, a new order emerged. Cyrus, the anointed of the Lord, decreed freedom for Israel to return and rebuild. The great empires shifted, but Moab and Ammon remained restless, watching the movements of their larger neighbors, seeking advantage, scheming for survival. Their lands became highways for conquering armies, their people vassals to whichever empire wielded the sword of the moment. And yet, in all this upheaval, one haunting question lingers. Were these empires merely tools in God's hand? The prophets declared it so. Assyria, the rod of my anger. Babylon, my hammer and weapon of war. Persia, whose king was called by name a century before his birth, my shepherd to fulfill God's purposes. If this was true, then the destinies of Moab and Ammon were not shaped by their own might, nor by their gods of stone and fire, but by the unseen will of the living God. Thus the rise of empires did not overshadow the tale of brothers at war. It magnified it. Moab and Ammon's pride was crushed beneath Assyrian cruelty, their altars mocked by Babylon's dominance, their survival at the mercy of Persia's decrees. The mighty and the small alike were swept into the current of prophecy. The stage of history was not merely about kings and armies, but about God writing his story in the rise and fall of nations. So we must ask, were Moab and Ammon, like Babylon and Assyria themselves, nothing more than actors in a divine drama? Or were they warnings, living parables of what becomes of those who war against their brothers and resist the covenant of the Almighty? The prophets of Israel were not mere poets. They were watchmen on the walls, voices of fire crying out against nations, declaring verdicts that shook kings to their knees. To Moab and Ammon, those brothers born of Lot's shame, the prophets spoke words heavy with judgment, warnings as sharp as swords, carried by the wind of eternity. Isaiah lifted his voice against Moab with lament and fury. Because Ar of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. Because Kir of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. His words painted images of wailing across every street, beards shaved, sackcloth draped, tears streaming down from Dibon to Nebo. The prophet saw not merely a military defeat, but a collapse of pride itself. He mourned for Moab's ruin, yet proclaimed it inevitable. Moab had mocked Zion, lifted its hand against God's people, and exalted Chemosh above the Almighty. Their downfall was certain. Jeremiah added his voice, carving prophecies like inscriptions of doom. Against Ammon he cried, "Has Israel no sons? Has he no heir? Why then has Milcom dispossessed Gad?" The Ammonites had seized land not their own, trampling on covenant boundaries set by the Lord himself. For this theft, Jeremiah declared, Ammon's cities would burn, its people would be scattered, and Milcom would go into exile with his priests. The gods of Ammon could not save them from the decree of the God of Israel. Then he turned his fire upon Moab. Moab has been at ease from his youth, never emptied from vessel to vessel. Therefore his taste remains in him, and his scent is not changed. A picture of complacency, of a nation grown arrogant in false security. Yet Jeremiah warned that days were coming when Moab would be poured out like wine, emptied and shattered. Moab shall be destroyed as a people, because he magnified himself against the Lord. Pride, the oldest sin, was the root of Moab's downfall. Ezekiel, the prophet of visions, also spoke against these ancient foes. He declared judgment not just for their violence, but for their laughter. When Judah fell, when the temple burned, Moab and Ammon mocked. They rejoiced at Zion's humiliation, and for that scorn, Ezekiel prophesied that God would hand them over to the sons of the east, their land given as spoil, their cities erased. It was not enough to stand neutral. Their joy at Israel's pain made them complicit in rebellion against God himself. Each prophecy was not just history foretold. It was a mirror held up to the nations. Moab and Ammon were condemned for arrogance, idolatry, violence, and joy at a brother's downfall. These sins are timeless. The warnings echo beyond their ruins, speaking to every nation and every heart that chooses pride over humility, false gods over the living God, hatred over covenant love. And yet, in the midst of judgment, glimmers of mercy appeared. Isaiah foresaw a day when a remnant of Moab would bring tribute to Mount Zion. Jeremiah declared that God would restore the fortunes of the Ammonites in the latter days. Even in their condemnation, the possibility of redemption lingered, if only they would turn back to the God of their fathers. But they did not. Moab and Ammon persisted in pride, persisted in enmity. Their names eventually vanished from history's map, absorbed into the sands of time. Yet their spirit, brothers turned against brothers, blood made bitter, covenant mocked, still lingers. The prophetic warnings stand as monuments, reminding us that pride, mockery, and hatred toward the people of God lead only to ruin. Could these words be unfolding in our own time? When nations rise against Israel, when mockery spreads across airwaves, when violence stirs at the borders of the Promised Land, do the ancient prophecies not whisper again? The warnings given to Moab and Ammon are not relics of dust. They are voices that still cry out, waiting for ears that will hear. Stand at the edge of the Jordan River today and look east. The lands once called Moab and Ammon stretch before your eyes, though their ancient names are gone. On modern maps, they are the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, a nation balancing between alliances, Arab identity, and uneasy peace with Israel. The hills are still there, the deserts still stretch wide, but the blood that once ran between brothers still stains the soil. The Jewish-Arab divide, so present in headlines and conflicts, is not merely the fruit of 20th century politics or colonial borders. It is ancient. It is older than empires, older than Islam, older even than the Temple in Jerusalem. The quarrel of Moab and Ammon with Israel was the seed of a fracture that still shapes the Middle East today. Consider the patterns. In the days of Moses, Moab hired Balaam to curse Israel. Today, nations gather in councils and coalitions to speak curses of another kind. Resolutions, condemnations, diplomatic walls raised against the Jewish state. The spirit is the same. Words sharpened like spears, seeking to isolate and weaken Israel, to declare that she has no right to the land promised by God. Ammon once sought to dispossess Israel of territory, claiming what God had given to the tribes of Gad and Reuben. Today, voices across the region echo the same claim, that Israel is an intruder, a thief, a nation with no rightful place in the land. The dispute over borders is not simply about lines on a map. It is the continuation of a very old argument, one first spoken by Ammonite kings standing at the Jordan's edge. Moab led Israel into idolatry, luring them with seduction and false worship. In modern form, this same tactic manifests not in altars to Chemosh, but in ideologies and movements that seek to draw Israel and the world away from covenant truth. The battlefield is no longer only physical. It is cultural, spiritual, and ideological. Propaganda spreads through airwaves as swiftly as Moabite women once moved through Israel's camp. And just as Moab and Ammon rejoiced when Judah fell, so too today there are nations and movements that celebrate when Israel suffers, when rockets fall on her cities, when terror strikes her streets, when political scandals shake her government. There are voices that cheer, just as Moab once mocked Zion's ruin. Ezekiel's words echo with chilling relevance. Those who rejoice at Israel's downfall invite judgment upon themselves. Yet, the parallels are not only about hostility. Just as God once promised that Moab and Ammon would be judged, but also that a remnant could be restored, so too today, Jordan stands in a fragile balance. Unlike many of Israel's neighbors, Jordan has a peace treaty with the Jewish state. It is not warm, but it endures. This strange coexistence mirrors the tension of ancient times, brothers by blood, enemies by history, yet bound together by geography and destiny. Beyond Jordan's borders, the wider Arab-Jewish divide burns. Iran, though not of Moab or Ammon's line, embodies the same spirit of opposition that once moved those nations. Russia and Western powers, like Babylon and Persia of old, circle the region, drawing smaller nations into their orbits, using the Middle East as a stage for power plays. The rise of empires is no relic of history. It is replaying before our eyes, and Israel, like in the days of Moses and Jephthah, stands at the center of it all, surrounded, scrutinized, sometimes betrayed by her own allies, yet still standing. The survival of Israel is itself a prophecy fulfilled, a testimony that the covenant made with Abraham has not been broken. Moab and Ammon may have vanished, but the spirit of their hostility is alive in the conflicts that flare from Gaza to Damascus, from Amman to Tehran. Do we not see prophecy unfolding in our news feeds? When nations rage against Israel, when alliances shift like desert sands, when peace treaties tremble and new wars ignite. Are these not the same patterns recorded in Scripture? The Bible does not merely tell us what was, it tells us what is and what will be. The Jewish-Arab divide is not simply a matter for politicians or generals. It is the living drama of prophecy, written in the bloodlines of Lot and Abraham, echoing across thousands of years, now playing out before cameras and satellites. To watch the Middle East is to watch the Bible in motion. The ancient warnings spoken to Moab and Ammon have not lost their edge. They cut across time, reminding us that those who lift their hands against the covenant people will face the judgment of the covenant God. And as nations posture and powers rise once more, the question burns hotter than ever. Are we not living inside prophecy right now? The clash of nations is loud. We see rockets streak across skies. Armies march, leaders exchange threats, and the world trembles at headlines. But Scripture reminds us that what meets the eye is only the surface. Beneath the dust of battle lies a deeper war, a conflict invisible to human sight, but more real than any tank or sword. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, wrote the Apostle Paul, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Ephesians 6-12. This was true in the days of Moab and Ammon, and it remains true today. The hostility of Moab and Ammon was not born only of politics or borders. It was stirred by spiritual forces bent on opposing the covenant of God. Chemosh, Milcom, Molech. These idols were not mere statues of stone. They were demonic powers, counterfeit thrones set up to divert worship away from the living God. When the Moabites sacrificed their children to Chemosh, when the Ammonites offered their sons and daughters to Molech's fire, they were not only committing atrocities of the flesh, they were bowing to principalities of darkness. Israel's wars against these nations were, therefore, not just military campaigns, but spiritual battles. Behind Balak's fear stood a spirit of divination, seeking to curse what God had blessed. Behind Ammon's cruelty stood the spirit of violence, mocking the inheritance of God's people. And when Israel stumbled into Moab's idolatry at Baal Peor, it was not only lust of the flesh, but seduction of the spirit, drawing the people into covenant with darkness. This same struggle continues today. The Middle East is more than a chessboard of human ambition. It is a battlefield of unseen powers. Every terrorist ideology, every corrupt regime, every movement that rises against Israel carries echoes of the ancient spirits that once ruled Moab and Ammon. The names may have changed, the banners may be different, but the powers are the same. The spirit of Molech still thrives wherever children are sacrificed in the name of ideology. The spirit of Chemosh still breathes wherever nations exalt their pride above the covenant of God. But the battle is not one-sided. Just as Israel was sustained in the wilderness by the presence of God, so too today the Lord surrounds his people like a wall of fire. Every time the enemy seeks to curse Israel, the word of God transforms it into blessing. Every time darkness rises, the covenant light burns brighter. The spiritual war is fierce, but the outcome has never been in doubt. The prophets remind us that the nations are like a drop in the bucket before the Almighty. The principalities that once ruled Moab and Ammon were crushed, their names erased, their altars forgotten. And so, too, the powers that rage today will fall when the King of Kings returns. The Jewish-Arab divide is real, and it is tragic, but its deepest roots lie not in blood or politics, but in the war of the unseen. To recognize this is to see the conflict in its true light, not merely as a quarrel of men, but as the battlefield of heaven and hell, the story that began in a cave after Sodom's fall, that thundered through the wars of judges and kings, that echoed in the cries of prophets and the rise of empires, has not reached its end. Scripture declares there is a day coming when all these threads will be drawn together, when the final reckoning will unfold, and the ancient quarrels of Moab and Ammon will find their conclusion in the shadow of the King's return. The prophet spoke of a day called the Day of the Lord, a time when the nations would gather against Israel, when the valleys east of the Jordan would once more become a stage of judgment. Zephaniah foresaw it. Moab shall be like Sodom, and the Ammonites like Gomorrah, a place possessed by nettles and salt pits, a waste forever. The remnant of my people shall plunder them. What began with a family feud will end with a divine verdict. The stage is global now. It is no longer Moab and Ammon alone, but a coalition of nations stirred by the same spirit of opposition, drawn like moths to the flame of Jerusalem. Armageddon. The word itself carries the weight of dread. The valley of decision, where kings and armies gather, where prophecy collides with history. In that day, the ancient hostility of Lot's sons will find its echo in the modern hostilities of Israel's enemies. And then, when the nations seem poised to crush Israel, when the world teeters on the brink of annihilation, prophecy declares that the heavens will open, the Mount of Olives will split in two, and the King of Kings will descend with power and glory. Not a star out of Jacob this time, but the very Son of Man, shining brighter than lightning from east to west. His feet will stand where prophets once wept, where armies once marched, and he will wage a final war, not with chariots or bombs, but with the sword of his mouth. Imagine the scene: the skies torn open, trumpets resounding, armies of heaven riding behind the Messiah. The nations rage, their weapons glittering, their pride unbroken. But in a single word, in a single act of divine fire, the empires of men crumble. Moab's pride, Ammon's cruelty, Babylon's arrogance, Rome's iron, and every modern echo, all swallowed up in the blaze of his return. For the King comes, not only to destroy, but to restore. In that day, the remnant of Israel will look upon the one they pierced and weep, not in despair, but in repentance and hope. The covenant first made with Abraham, tested in the deserts of Moab and Ammon, will find its final fulfillment. Peace will no longer be a fragile treaty signed in fear, but a river flowing from Jerusalem, healing nations, silencing hatred, binding brothers once more. The coming fulfillment is not merely the end of a story. It is the climax of all stories. The feud of Moab and Ammon was a shadow of the greater war, the endless struggle between rebellion and covenant, pride and humility, darkness and light. And that war will end when the Messiah reigns, when swords are beaten into plowshares, when the Jewish-Arab divide, the echo of brothers at war, is healed under the rule of the Prince of Peace. This is the destiny toward which history races. The kingdoms rise, the armies march, the prophets warn, but the final word belongs not to Moab, not to Ammon, not to Babylon or Persia, not to any power of this age. The final word belongs to the King. The story of Moab and Ammon is not a footnote buried in dusty scrolls. It is the pulse of prophecy, the echo of a wound that began in a cave and spread across centuries. Brothers turned into enemies, kin who should have shared bread but instead raised swords, a family feud that became a battlefield of nations. Their story was written in blood and stone, but also in prophecy, and that prophecy has not yet finished unfolding. We began with betrayal, the daughters of Lot, the birth of Moab and Ben-Ammi. From shame was born enmity, from kinship came division. We watched as their descendants mocked Israel, denied them passage, hired curses, and offered their children to false gods. We saw Israel falter, then rise again by the hand of the Almighty, and through it all, the prophets thundered, declaring judgment against pride, arrogance, and joy at a brother's downfall. Empires rose and fell. Assyria's cruelty, Babylon's arrogance, Persia's decrees. But Moab and Ammon remained restless, never reconciled, never healed. They chose rebellion over covenant, pride over humility, idols over the living God. And so their names faded, their cities crumbled, their people scattered. Yet their spirit, the spirit of division and hostility toward God's people, has not died. It lives on in the turmoil of the Middle East, in the Jewish-Arab divide, in the endless wars that draw the gaze of the whole world to this small strip of land. Look at today's headlines. Rockets falling, peace talks faltering, alliances shifting, ancient hatreds refusing to die. Is it coincidence? Or is it prophecy alive before our very eyes? The same forces that drove Moab and Ammon to resist Israel are at work in our world, shaping nations, stirring hostilities, mocking the covenant people. Behind the politics lies the same spiritual war Paul described. Principalities and powers raging against the purposes of God. But the story does not end in despair. The prophets did not only warn, they also whispered hope. Isaiah foresaw that a remnant of Moab would bring tribute to Zion. Jeremiah declared that even the fortunes of Ammon could be restored in the latter days, and above all, the visions point to a final fulfillment. The day when the Messiah returns, when the King sets his feet on the Mount of Olives, when nations are judged and peace flows from Jerusalem like a river. On that day, the curse of brother against brother will be broken. The Jewish-Arab divide, born in the rivalry of Moab and Ammon, will be healed not by treaties or armies, but by the reign of the Prince of Peace. Swords will become plowshares. Enemies will sit at the same table. The ancient wound will finally close in the light of the eternal King. This is not fantasy. It is not wishful thinking. It is prophecy. And prophecy has never failed. So, as we look back on Moab and Ammon, we must also look forward. The story of brothers at war warns us against pride, against mocking those who suffer, against exalting ourselves above the purposes of God. It also calls us to watch, to discern the times, to recognize that we are living inside prophecy right now. If these revelations stir your heart, if you sense the weight of history converging on our present, then do not let the story end here. Share it, speak it, reflect on it. Let others see that the Bible is not a relic of the past. It is the living Word, alive in the news, alive in our world, alive in prophecy unfolding before our eyes. Subscribe, like, share, and comment to help spread these revelations. Let the message of Moab and Ammon, brothers at war, open the eyes of those who think the Bible is silent about today. For it speaks, and it speaks with power. And this is only one mystery unveiled. Next time, we will journey deeper into another prophecy, another ancient feud still shaping our world. For the Bible is a map, and history is the road upon which it is drawn. Follow the path and you will see. Prophecy is not finished. The greatest chapters are yet to come.